You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
What is the modern military? Now, I don't mean tanks, robots, autonomous vehicles, drones, tooled up infantrymen fighting 3-block wars. What I mean is it a profession? Is it a vocation? Is it something that belongs to society? Is it a part of society? Is it apart from society? These are all very interesting questions on how we define the modern military, and I know some people out there have been trying to redefine the modern military. G'day listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. Now, we've been away for a bit of a break, a mid-year break in fact, and hopefully you all have enjoyed not listening to me for a while. That's changed. I'm back in your ears and back in your life, and you're going to have to deal with it. We still have the Patreon program going for those people that want to support the show with a little bit of tin. Feel free to sling it our way. We will collect it. We're also pumping out the bonus episodes. We've just dropped one just about 20 minutes ago before I started recording this interview. So please, if you really feel like the show is your best friend, it is worth your time. In fact, you ignore your family to listen to me, then maybe you can show some love with a little bit of coin. But if not, we're happy to give you the free content anyways. And in fact, the free content's where we get our really fun guests, like my guest today. My guest today is Dr Pauline Shanks Kaurin. Now, she's an academically trained philosopher. That's right, they exist. And an ethicist. Not convinced ethicists are really out there, but she is one. She's interested in military ethics, business ethics, and applying ethical thinking to policy questions. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Pacific Lutheran University, and she's currently the professor of military ethics and Stockdale chair of professional military ethics at the United States Naval War College. She is the author of The Warrior, Military Ethics and Contemporary Warfare, Achilles Goes Asymmetrical, still one of my most favourite ever titles of a book, particularly a book on military ethics. I've read a couple. It's a lot more creative than just and unjust wars. I mean, come on, Walter, what were you thinking? Now, that was published by Ashgate in 2014. And Pauline, for the purposes of this episode, she's got a chapter in a book that's coming out next month that's been edited by some fellas that we know on the show. That is Nate, Finney and Tyrell Mayfield. The title of that book is Redefining the Modern Military. However, Pauline's greatest accolade in her professional career is actually being the only guest to appear 3 times on this show. Pauline, thanks for coming on the show yet again.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be the only person who's been on 3 times. Y'all must be desperate.
Yes, we are. Just kidding, Pauline. Now, before we start discussing the modern military profession, I'm not going to get you to go into your life story about your dad working on missiles and you liking the questions about, why go to war, because you've done that previously. So let's talk about how you got involved in this project.
This project actually started as many things do on Twitter. I was teaching a military ethics class that I teach every January at Pacific Lutheran University, and preparing for class, I like to pose whatever question we're going to talk about in class that day and then see what people on the Twitter machine have to say. And so that particular day, I posed a question about whether people thought the military was a profession, and if it was, did that apply just to officers, to non-commissioned officers, or also to enlisted? And there was quite an energetic discussion as a result of those questions.
Yeah.
And eventually that discussion morphed into this book project because people, including Nate and Ty, really thought that this was a question that warranted some deeper inquiry, and that there were people both in the military and academics like myself outside the military who had things to say about the topic. And you do have people like Don Snyder, who was at the U.S. Army War College, who had been writing on it for quite some time, but there hadn't been a lot of recent scholarship, at least not in book form, collected in book form, that perhaps could be used as a part of PME or could be used in civilian institutions. So there did seem to be a gap. And so the book project came about as a way to try to fill that gap. And it's a gap I found in my own class, because trying to find materials for my students to read, we ended up reading classic things like, Samuel Huntington and Don Snyder and things like that. And I think this book collection also represents a greater diversity, not just of perspective, but there's gender diversity there as well, which is important to me in military ethics as a woman in military ethics.
All right, so it's actually, I noticed that about the book. There are actually some very diverse voices, including there's a gender mix. There's also a nationality mix, which is good. But I'm actually not going to talk about any of the other authors in this episode. I actually just want to talk about your work. So it's nice to talk about them, but they can get their own interviews. Now let's begin very, 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 very basically, so I can understand, and also my obtuse listeners, because I have some of the most obtuse listeners out there, and I need them to be able to follow along. What makes a profession?
Well, historically, medicine and law and the clergy were the professions. And so a profession is something where you have a community of practitioners who have some kind of expertise, and they are given special permissions by society to do something in the interest of the common good. They're also a community that is self-regulating. They decide who enters their community, what the standards of the community are, and they also decide who might be expelled from the community. I mean, that's sort of, very, very basic. But the idea here as a profession is it serves the common good. Society gives them special permission to do things that other people are not allowed to do. There's a certain kind of expertise, and they have to be they're understood as being self-regulating. So we could see how medicine fits, how law fits, and in the case of the military is given special permission to kill and break things because of this understanding that they have a particular expertise around the management and use of violence, but not violence for its own sake, but violence for the protection of the state or for some kind of common good interest.
Okay, then. So it sounds like the military kind of meets the requirements, but from reading your chapter, I also kind of get the sense that seeing the military as a profession in the same way that medicine, law, and the clergy were seen as professions is relatively new?
Yeah, I think so. At least the consensus that it should be considered a profession. I think as militaries became more professionalized, meaning more sort of bureaucratic and having what we would think of as professional practices, starting in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the discussion about the military as a profession, I think, is really more of a 20th century conversation, and mid to late 20th century conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's, a lot of people probably just assume that it is considered an old profession in those terms. But I guess if we reach back, war and soldiers and soldiering and fighting was actually done more as a societal effort as opposed to a bespoke professional force. So I guess my next question sort of leans on how you mentioned the. Sorry, go on.
Oh no, go ahead.
And I guess this leads me to where you mentioned that the military is kind of having an aspirational professional status. So, I know this because I read your chapter and understood every single word, of course. But what, for my listeners, do you mean by this, and why is it important for the military to aspire to be and actually even develop as professionals?
Well, I use the idea that the military is a profession aspirationally because I'm not necessarily making the empirical or factual case that every person in the military thinks of themselves as a professional, or every aspect of things that happen in the military that we could always describe that as professional, or as reflecting the idea of a profession. So I think it's aspirational because I think that's a productive way to think about how the military wants to think about itself and ought to think about itself. I think that the military ought to aspire to be a profession. And there's a debate about not just whether the military is a profession, but who in the military are to be considered professionals. And there's a long line of argument going back to Samuel Huntington that it's really only the officers, and then perhaps if we stretch things, non-commissioned officers, NCOs, who could be considered professionals. But the average enlisted person, the argument goes, can't be considered a professional. They're not professional. They are there to do a job, but they don't have the same kind of intellectual capacity and expertise that would be required to think of someone as a professional. So that's what I'm kind of getting at. I don't necessarily agree with that line of argument, especially in the context of an all-volunteer military force like we have in the United States and some other countries have as well. So that's why I'm using this idea of aspirational, that this is what we should be going for. And it's aspirational. There's ethical dimensions that come with that. There's moral requirements that come with that as well.
And I suppose just to ad-lib forward in a non-prepared question, because listeners, I do like to put my guests on the spot. If we diverge from the classical point of view, Huntington's idea that officers as managers of violence are the professionals and soldiers are merely the practitioners of that violence, the doers, the tradesmen, so to speak. But there's a thing called professional codes, and you mentioned a little bit in there in your chapter. You mentioned about it, and you also just before mentioned a little bit about ethics. If we are to hold our soldiers as well as officers within our societies, I'm talking liberal democracies here, so all my listeners in totalitarian states, you kind of have a different beat to follow when it comes to ethical behaviour. Come over to our side though, it's pretty decent. However, in Western liberal democracies, where we have a society that holds all of our military to account for their behaviour in war, does that mean that we probably owe it to the members of the military to understand them as professionals?
I think so. I mean, I suppose you could make the argument that, people in a non-professional job still have to follow the law and still have some accountability. But I don't think it's to the level that we would think of in the military, because there is a code of conduct. There's the core values. There's other documents the warrior ethos, other kinds of things that even very low-ranking enlisted members of the military are expected to understand and expected to internalize. So when you join the military, you're not just doing a job, you're joining a moral community of practice. And I think that that's what moves us into this discussion about it being a profession. You're joining a community that's self-regulating and that has been given special permission to do things by society. And so I think that gives you a higher level of ethical accountability and responsibility than, the gal who cuts my hair. She still has to follow the law and health standards, but it's a different kind of concept, I think. And even for the average, infantry person on the ground, if they're not a professional, then what are they? And that seems very odd that they're not a professional, but the people who are commanding them are. And that I think that strains against the notion of the military as a cohesive unit, as a team that's supposed to work together, as a community of moral practice. So I do think that we might argue that there are different levels of professionalism or different levels of responsibility. So the flag officer, we might say, has more responsibility, and we would expect a higher level of professionalism than the infantry person on the ground. But I think there's a way in which we could still say they're both professionals. They both belong to this community, and there are moral expectations that go with that membership.
And I absolutely love that you used communities of practice there, and then have expanded upon Wegner's theory and thrown in communities of moral practice, which I think is a great term. In fact, I'm just going to throw it out there whenever I have conversations about ethics now. But it's interesting, the idea of communities of practice is a very strong one in terms of how we develop learning systems, not just in the traditional professions or the military profession, but lots of different vocations out there are starting to understand how communities of practice can tie into it. So I think that's something our listeners can really sink their teeth into if they really suffer from a big dose of insomnia. Go grab Wegner's Communities of Practice and give it a read. But listeners, we need to push to the future, because we're not just defining the military, and we're not just looking back at Huntington, good bloke that he was. We're looking forward to the future. So I guess my last question on this topic for you, Pauline, before we push to the final question, the one everyone loves and you've already answered a couple of times. But I guess what I want to know is, in terms of viewing the military as a profession, what does the future hold?
I think that's a good question. I think the first thing is this debate about whether the character of warfare is changing. It certainly seems like with AI and other technological developments, at least some pieces of the character of war are changing. It's perhaps becoming more decentralized. So I think we have to think about what the ramifications of that are for the profession. Is the profession going to remain hierarchical, or are we going to start thinking in terms of more of a flat, perhaps organizational structure, or at least a flat culture where, you have things like mission command or, the older concept of the strategic corporal, where people lower down the chain of command are going to have to be making really important decisions, and you can no longer rely on this hierarchy. The other piece is that many of the people it used to be the case that it was the officers who were well educated, perhaps some of the NCOs, and then other people had lower levels of education, but that's simply not the case anymore. And so this issue of what intellectual capacities are needed, to be a professional, I think. I understand what Huntington was saying, but I think to some degree the picture he's painting is no longer the picture that exists. And so with those changes in education, and also with changes in technology that allow people who perhaps haven't had formal kinds of education to be knowledgeable about lots of different kinds of things. I think we have to rethink that idea of what kinds of intellectual capacities are necessary to be a professional. And I think it's a similar conversation that they're having in the medical field. So I might go to my doctor, but I've also been to my nurse practitioner, and there are some days I actually like him a lot better and think he knows more what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are the kinds of complexities that we're going to have to be really thinking about as we move forward, and at least as some pieces of how we practice warfare start to change or technology starts to impact those.
Well, Pauline, that's quite a lot to process for the future. Luckily, our listeners have 14 days before the next episode, so they can listen to this a couple of times. Now, listeners, I urge you to go out and grab this book once it becomes available. We definitely haven't given you the juiciest parts of Pauline's chapter, so you're still going to have to read it, especially the 4 conclusions at the end. But Pauline, for us, now it is time to get to my final question. You know the one I ask of all guests.
Yes, most definitely.
It relates to our mission on the show, and we are trying to define and discuss war in as many ways possible, just like Big Carl did, the dead Prussian himself, because it's such an important conversation for society to be involved in. Now, I ask each guest, and I've asked you twice before, to finish this sentence. I ask you now to finish the sentence, war is
a values statement. So if you tell me what you will go to war over, that tells me what you actually value or what you think is important. Because war is a difficult, daunting enterprise, and in general, human beings don't enter into it entirely lightly. And it's not just about what we say we value, but what we actually value. I think if you're going to go to war over something, that tells us something about what you actually in practice value.
Wow, that's quite a good one. War is a value statement, and it makes absolute sense to me. So it's probably a little bit too simple, but listeners, that's all we have time for on the show today or tonight, depending on where you are. So, Pauline, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you for writing such interesting stuff to make us all think about things like the profession and the ethics of our military forces. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, listeners, you can grab Pauline's book, The Warrior, Military Ethics in Contemporary Warfare, Achilles Goes Asymmetrical, on our book depository page, and you can get there by clicking on the show notes. So not only will Pauline pick up a big, fat royalty check if you do that, we'll also skim a little bit off the top as you get free delivery from Book Depository. We're also putting out a link in these show notes for the pre-order of Redefining the Modern Military. I'll say that again because I stuffed it. Redefining the Modern Military. I might just leave that in there so listeners know that I too am fallible. We'll also try and skim a little bit of tin off that so that the money doesn't go just to the editors, Ty and Nate. Now you can find Pauline on Twitter at Queen of Thin Air. You can also expect a new book from Pauline coming out late next year, which means Pauline's more than likely going to be not only the first guest to be on the show 3 times, but probably the first guest to be on the show 4 times. And finally, guess you heard me plug it at the start, and I'm going to plug it at the end again. If you want bonus content, if you want to jump in and do the book club with me, which is where we all just sit down over our webcams and we talk about a book that we've been reading for a month or 2, or if you want to pay a lot of money, you can get some one-on-one time with yours truly. Jump on patreon.com, find The Dead Prussian, which is patreon.com/The Dead Prussian, and become a legend. That's right, our subscribers are legends. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.